In a quiet suburban home on Maple Street, a 67-year-old widow was about to discover the true cost of family loyalty. What started as opening her doors to help loved ones took a shocking turn when she came face to face with systematic manipulation, disguised as gratitude. Margaret Chen wasn't your typical retired school administrator. For over 30 years, she had spent her life managing difficult situations and challenging personalities, known for her ability to find peaceful solutions to complex problems. When she encountered Jessica's controlling behavior taking root in her own kitchen, she had no idea she was walking into a psychological battle for her very identity. Margaret's initial accommodation that would lead to a family war that would redefine everything she thought she knew about love and boundaries. What began as a generous offer to help family in need would become a fight for the soul of her own home. The neighborhood would never be the same after witnessing how far one woman would go to reclaim her dignity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen stood at her front window, watching the U-Haul truck lumber down Maple Street like some great wounded animal. The afternoon sun caught the scratches along its metal sides, evidence of countless moves, countless fresh starts. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling her pulse quicken with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Anticipation, perhaps, or dread masquerading as hope. The truck wheezed to a stop in her driveway, and Margaret's reflection wavered in the window. 67 years old, silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn since Robert's funeral 2 years ago. The same navy cardigan that had become her armor against the world's sharp edges. But today, for the first time in months, her eyes held something other than the quiet resignation that had settled there like dust. "They're here," she whispered to the empty house, though Robert's absence still echoed in every room. David emerged first from the truck's cab, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to apologize for existing. At 35, her son had inherited her conflict-averse nature, but none of Robert's quiet strength. His IT job at the telecommunications company had been reliable once, before the layoffs, before the reduced hours that barely covered rent on their cramped apartment across town. Jessica followed, her movements sharp and efficient as she surveyed the suburban street with calculating eyes. Margaret had always found her daughter-in-law beautiful in the way that made others step back. Polished, controlled, with dark hair that never seemed to catch the wind wrong. But today, something in Jessica's expression reminded Margaret of a real estate appraiser, cataloging square footage and potential. "Grandma!" Sophie's voice cut through Margaret's observations like sunlight through clouds. 8 years old, and all knees and elbows, the girl bounded up the front steps with the kind of unguarded joy that made Margaret's chest tight. Too many apartments, too many temporary arrangements had taught Sophie to find happiness in small moments. Margaret opened the door before Sophie could knock, and the girl launched herself into her grandmother's arms with the full weight of childhood affection. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to breathe in the smell of strawberry shampoo and playground dust, feeling something in her chest unlock. "We're really going to live here?" Sophie asked, pulling back to study Margaret's face with those serious brown eyes that missed nothing. "For as long as you need," Margaret said, meaning it in ways that scared her. Jessica's heels clicked against the porch steps, each sound precise and measured. "Mrs. Chen, I can't tell you how grateful we are." Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to charm her way through corporate meetings. "This is such a godsend." Margaret noticed how Jessica's gaze swept over the faded welcome mat, the slight crack in the front doors, paint. A mental inventory, subtle but thorough. David appeared with the first load of boxes, his smile apologetic in the way that had become his default expression. "Mom, you sure about this? I know it's a lot to ask." "Nonsense." Margaret stepped aside to let them enter, watching Jessica's reaction as they crossed the threshold into the living room Robert had painted sage green 3 summers ago. Family helps family. Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. It's very homey, she said, her tone suggesting that wasn't entirely a compliment. Her gaze lingered on Robert's recliner, positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light streaming through the bay window. Though I imagine we'll need to make some adjustments for Sophie's needs. Of course, Margaret said, though something cold settled in her stomach. The afternoon dissolved into the choreography of moving, boxes labeled in Jessica's neat handwriting, furniture wrapped in blankets that smelled of other people's lives. Margaret found herself trailing behind, offering help that was politely declined, watching her space fill with evidence of other lives, other choices. When David carried Sophie's pink bicycle past Robert's den, Margaret felt compelled to speak. I converted Robert's office into a bedroom for Sophie, she said, opening the door to reveal walls she'd painted lavender herself, staying up until midnight to finish before their arrival. I thought she might like the window seat. Sophie's gasp of delight made the sleepless nights worthwhile. The girl ran to the built-in bench beneath the window, pressing her face to the glass to watch birds in the oak tree Robert had planted when David was Sophie's age. It's perfect, Grandma! Sophie turned back with a grin that cracked something open in Margaret's chest. But Jessica's expression remained carefully neutral as she examined the room. The paint fumes might be strong for a child, she said, though Margaret had finished the work weeks ago. And this carpet, when was it last cleaned? David shot his wife a warning look, but Jessica continued her assessment, noting the room's dimensions, the placement of electrical outlets, as if already planning improvements. Dinner that evening felt like a performance none of them had rehearsed. Margaret had prepared David's childhood favorite, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe she'd perfected during his teenage years when cooking was her primary language of love. But Jessica picked at her food, making small comments about sodium content and portion sizes. The job market's been brutal, David said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd spent months crafting resumes and attending interviews that led nowhere. 3 rounds of cuts at the company this year. I'm lucky to still have 30 hours a week. And my position was eliminated entirely, Jessica added, her tone suggesting this was a personal failing of the universe rather than corporate restructuring. 6 years with the marketing firm, and they decided to streamline operations. She used air quotes like weapons. Margaret set down her fork. You'll bounce back. Both of you. Smart, capable people like yourselves. It's not about capability, Jessica interrupted, her mask slipping slightly. It's about being expendable, about companies that don't value loyalty or experience. Her gaze swept the dining room, taking in the china cabinet with its mismatched dishes, the wallpaper border with tiny roses that had been there since Margaret's mother's time. About making do with what you're given instead of demanding what you deserve. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Margaret felt their weight settle on her shoulders. Sophie continued eating, oblivious to the undercurrents, chattering about her new room and whether the tree outside her window had any squirrels. You're welcome here as long as you need, Margaret said again, though this time the words felt more like a promise than an invitation. This house has room for all of us. David reached across the table to squeeze his mother's hand. I don't know how to thank you, Mom. After everything you've been through, losing Dad. His voice cracked slightly. Margaret squeezed back, remembering Robert's hands, how they'd felt covering hers during their last conversation about family, about legacy, about the importance of keeping the people you love close enough to protect. Later, after Sophie had been tucked into her new bed with the window seat, Margaret found herself alone in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with practiced efficiency. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jessica and David's voices in the living room, low, urgent, the kind of conversation that stopped when others entered the room. I can't breathe in here, Jessica was saying. Everything feels so cramped, like living in a museum. It's temporary, David's voice placating. "Just until we get back on our feet." "Is it, though? Your mother seems pretty comfortable having us here, and Sophie's already acting like this is her permanent home." Margaret's hands stilled on the dinner plates. She'd painted Sophie's room lavender. She'd bought juice boxes and string cheese, filled the house with the sound of a child's laughter for the first time since David had grown up and moved away. When had comfort become a problem? The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, the same sounds that had lulled her to sleep beside Robert for 40 years. But tonight, they felt different, like warnings she couldn't quite decode. Upstairs, Jessica lay in the guest room that had once been Margaret's sewing space, staring at the ceiling and cataloging everything that would need to change. The wallpaper was dated, the furniture arrangement inefficient. The kitchen lacked proper storage. The living room felt cluttered with memories that belonged to other people, other decades. She'd grown up in foster homes where nothing belonged to her, where comfort was temporary and always at someone else's discretion. She'd sworn she'd never live that way again. But here she was, 32 years old and dependent on the charity of a woman who still kept her dead husband's coffee mug on the counter. Something would have to be done. Small changes at first, practical improvements that Margaret would understand, even appreciate. After all, they were family now. They all had to make adjustments. The house groaned softly around them. 3 generations, under one roof, each with their own expectations of what home should feel like. And in the morning, the real work would begin. The changes began like morning frost, so gradual Margaret barely noticed until they'd already taken hold. 3 weeks after the U-Haul had pulled away, Margaret descended the stairs to find Jessica reorganizing her kitchen cabinets with the methodical precision of someone conducting an inventory. Plates that had lived on the second shelf for 20 years now resided behind the cereal boxes. Her coffee mugs, including Robert's favorite with the faded fishing logo, had been relocated to a cabinet she needed a step stool to reach. "Good morning," Jessica said without looking up from her work. She wore yoga pants and a fitted top that somehow made Margaret feel overdressed in her terry cloth robe. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought we could make the kitchen more functional for a family with a child." Margaret stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, watching a stranger rearrange the geography of her daily routines. "Of course," she heard herself say. "That's very thoughtful." Jessica's smile was bright and efficient. "The way you had things organized was fine for one person, but with Sophie needing to reach plates and cups." She gestured toward the yaitsigi, lower cabinets where Margaret's good china had been displaced by plastic dinnerware. "This just makes more sense." More sense. The words settled in Margaret's chest like stones. When had her way of doing things stopped making sense? "Where did you put Robert's mug?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it. Jessica paused, a stack of bowls balanced in her arms. "The coffee mugs are up there now." She nodded toward the high cabinet. "More space for everyday dishes down here where Sophie can help set the table." Margaret reached for the step stool she'd never needed before, feeling Jessica's eyes on her as she stretched to retrieve the mug that had held Robert's coffee every morning for 15 years. The ceramic felt foreign in her hands, as if it had forgotten her touch in the space of one night. "Actually," Jessica continued, her voice carrying that practiced tone Margaret was beginning to recognize, "I was thinking we might want to streamline the kitchen items. You know, keep only what we actually use regularly." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret clutched Robert's mug tighter. Over the following days, Margaret began to notice other shifts. Her laundry basket, which she'd always kept in the hallway closet, had been moved to the basement to reduce clutter in the common areas. The television remote had migrated to Jessica's side of the coffee table. Even the thermostat settings had changed. Jessica preferred the house cooler, claiming it was better for Sophie's allergies. "I hope you don't mind," Jessica said each time. her apologies feeling more like announcements than requests for permission. Margaret found herself asking permission for things that had never required permission before. Could she run the dishwasher? Jessica had established an optimal schedule for appliance usage. Could she watch her evening news program? Sophie needed quiet time for homework, and the living room television was too loud. Maybe you could watch in your bedroom, Jessica suggested with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. It would be more comfortable for you anyway. So Margaret retreated upstairs at 7 each evening, something she hadn't done since recovering from pneumonia 2 winters ago. From her bedroom, she could hear the murmur of family life continuing without her. Sophie's laughter, Jessica directing David through some household project, the sounds of people who belonged. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret went to sit in Robert's chair, the brown leather recliner that had molded to his body over 20 years, where she'd curled up every evening since his funeral to feel close to him again. The chair was gone. Margaret searched the living room as if it might be hiding, as if she'd somehow overlooked a piece of furniture that had anchored the room's entire layout. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she called out, "Jessica, have you seen—" "Oh, the old recliner?" Jessica appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I moved it to the basement. It was taking up so much space, and honestly, it didn't really fit with the room's flow. David helped me rearrange everything while you were at the grocery store." Margaret stared at the space where Robert's chair had been, now occupied by a sleek ottoman that Jessica must have retrieved from storage. The entire room looked different. More coordinated, perhaps, but utterly foreign. "I should have asked first," Jessica continued, though her tone suggested she was checking off a social obligation rather than expressing genuine regret. "But I thought you'd appreciate having more space for Sophie to play." "Of course," Margaret whispered, because what else could she say? That she needed that chair? That it smelled like Robert's aftershave and contained the impression of his body? That some evenings it was the only place she felt less alone? "Where did you put it?" she asked instead. "Down by the washing machine. I thought maybe it could be a nice reading spot for you when you're doing laundry." A reading spot by the washing machine. Robert's chair, relegated to the basement like an unwanted appliance. That evening, Elena Vasquez arrived for their weekly coffee, bringing the energy of someone who'd spent 45 years refusing to accept other people's nonsense. Margaret's best friend since their children had played together in kindergarten, Elena had the gift of seeing through pretense with surgical precision. "Where's Robert's chair?" Elena asked the moment she entered the living room. Before Margaret could answer, Jessica appeared with Sophie in tow. "Mrs. Vasquez, how nice to see you. We've been doing some redecorating, creating a more child-friendly space." Elena's dark eyes swept the room, cataloging changes with the efficiency of someone who'd spent her legal career reading between lines. "I see. Would you like some coffee?" Jessica continued, already moving toward the kitchen. "I've been experimenting with different brewing methods, more precise than the old way." Elena waited until Jessica was out of earshot before leaning closer to Margaret. "The old way? She means your way?" "It's fine," Margaret said quickly. "She's just trying to help, make things work better for everyone." But Elena's expression remained skeptical. When Jessica returned with coffee served in mugs Margaret didn't recognize, Elena accepted hers with polite thanks and watchful eyes. "Sophie," Jessica said, settling onto the couch with practiced grace, "why don't you tell Mrs. Vasquez about your new room?" Sophie launched into an enthusiastic description of her window seat and the birds in the oak tree, but her narrative took an unexpected turn. "And Mommy says we're going to make the whole house look better, not like old lady stuff anymore." The words landed like a slap. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as Jessica's face tightened with embarrassment. "Sophie, that's not—" "We talked about this," Jessica said, her voice sharp enough to make the child shrink back. "We're making improvements, not criticizing Grandma's choices." But the damage was done. Elena's expression had hardened into something Margaret recognized from the courtroom days, the look of someone preparing for battle. "Old lady stuff," Elena repeated slowly. "Interesting perspective." The visit ended early, Elena citing a sudden need to check on her own grandchildren. But her hug lingered longer than usual, and her whispered, "Call me if you need anything," carried weight that made Margaret's throat tight. After they'd gone to bed, Margaret crept down to the basement. She found Robert's chair wedged between the water heater and a stack of Christmas decorations, looking forlorn and out of place. She ran her hands over the worn leather, remembering how Robert used to fall asleep there during Sunday football games, how she'd cover him with the afghan her mother had knitted. The chair was heavy, but grief had made her stronger than she looked. She managed to wrestle it up the stairs, pausing on each landing to catch her breath and listen for sounds of the others stirring. By the time she maneuvered it into her bedroom, her back ached and her nightgown was damp with perspiration. But Robert's chair fit perfectly in the corner by her window, angled to catch the morning light. She sank into its familiar embrace, feeling the cushions remember the shape of her body, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered in the fabric. Through the walls, she could hear the house settling around its new occupants, the creak of David turning over in the guest room, Sophie's soft breathing from the converted office, Jessica's presence somehow taking up space even in sleep. Margaret stared at the chair that now lived in exile, like a refugee from her own life. When had she become a guest in her own home? When had her routines become inconveniences, her possessions become obstacles, her very presence something to be managed and contained? The question followed her into uneasy dreams, where she wandered through rooms that looked like hers but belonged to someone else, searching for something she couldn't name in a house that no longer felt like home. Margaret woke in Robert's chair, her neck stiff from sleeping upright and morning light streaming across her face. For a moment, the disorientation was complete. Why was she in the bedroom chair instead of her bed? Then, memory returned like cold water. The basement, the midnight rescue mission, the growing sense of exile in her own home. Downstairs, she found Jessica at the kitchen table with a laminated chart spread before her like a military operation map. Sophie sat beside her, coloring in squares with purple crayon, while Jessica explained the new system in tones usually reserved for corporate presentations. "Good morning," Jessica said, without looking up. "I've created a household schedule to help everyone contribute to maintaining our living space." Margaret poured coffee from the pot Jessica had moved to a different counter. Apparently, its original location hadn't been optimal for morning traffic flow. The mug she reached for was plastic, decorated with cartoon characters. Her real mugs remained in the high cabinet, too much trouble to retrieve each morning. "A schedule?" Margaret asked, though she could already see her name written in Jessica's precise handwriting across multiple rows. "Just basic tasks to keep things running smoothly." Jessica's finger traced down the chart. "Sophie will help with sorting laundry. It's good for her to learn responsibility. David has yard work on weekends, and I've assigned you some light housekeeping that fits your schedule." Margaret studied the chart over Jessica's shoulder, noting how her own contributions had been categorized under light housekeeping, dusting, organizing, grocery shopping. Tasks that suggested she was a helpful relative rather than the homeowner. "I've always managed the housework myself," Margaret said carefully. "Of course, but now we're a team." Jessica's smile was bright and reasonable. "Besides, you shouldn't have to carry the full burden. We're all benefiting from living here." The word benefiting struck Margaret as odd. She was providing free housing, utilities, and most of the groceries. What exactly was her benefit in this arrangement? "Speaking of schedules," Jessica continued, producing another laminated sheet, "I've worked out kitchen and television time slots. Sophie needs consistent meal times, and we all deserve some personal space for entertainment. Margaret found herself assigned to breakfast preparation between 6 and 7:30, lunch as needed, and dinner every other day. Her evening news program had been moved to 8:30, after Sophie's bedtime, after Jessica's cooking shows, squeezed into the gap before David's sports highlights. "What if I want to cook dinner tonight?" Margaret asked, the question emerging before she'd fully formed the thought. Jessica's pause was subtle but telling. "Tonight's my turn according to the schedule, but if you really want to cook, I suppose we could make an exception." An exception. To cook dinner in her own kitchen. Margaret felt something hot and unfamiliar rise in her chest, a flash of anger that she quickly tamped down. Family harmony, she reminded herself. Sophie's stability. These were temporary arrangements while they got back on their feet. "The schedule is fine," she said, though the words tasted like sawdust. Later that morning, Margaret discovered she couldn't access her computer. The Wi-Fi password had been changed, and when she asked Jessica about it, her daughter-in-law looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, I updated the network security. You didn't get the new password?" Jessica patted her pockets as if searching for something. "It's probably written down somewhere. I'll find it for you later." But later never came. When Margaret asked again that evening, Jessica was busy helping Sophie with homework. The next morning, she was on an important phone call about job prospects. By the third day, Margaret stopped asking. The breaking point came during dinner. Preparation. Margaret had decided to make her grandmother's beef stew, a recipe that required slow braising and careful timing. She'd started early, browning the meat and layering flavors the way 3 generations of women had taught her. Jessica entered the kitchen like a storm front, Sophie trailing behind her. "What's that smell?" Jessica asked, though her tone suggested she already disapproved of the answer. "Beef stew, your favorite when you were dating David," Margaret said, stirring the pot that had been simmering for hours. Jessica approached the stove with the expression of someone examining a crime scene. She lifted the lid and frowned. "This seems very heavy. Sophie's been having digestive issues lately. The doctor said we should avoid rich foods. I could make her something lighter." No, it's fine." Jessica's tone suggested it was anything but fine. "Sophie, what do you think about Grandma's cooking?" The 8-year-old looked between the adults, sensing the trap but too young to navigate it. "It smells good? But remember what we talked about? About eating healthy foods that make our bodies strong?" Jessica's voice carried the patient instruction of a teacher correcting a slow student. Grandma's cooking is from a different time when people didn't know as much about nutrition. Margaret felt the words like physical blows, a different time, as if her recipes, her knowledge, her very way of nurturing her family had become obsolete. "I'll make Sophie some pasta," Jessica continued, already moving to take control of the kitchen. "Something simple her stomach can handle." Margaret stood at her own stove, watching Jessica commandeer the space with efficient movements, relegating the beef stew to a back burner like an unwanted experiment. Sophie received her plain pasta with enthusiasm that felt forced, glancing apologetically at Margaret between bites. The next afternoon, Margaret escaped to her garden, the one space Jessica hadn't yet reorganized. She was deadheading roses when Mrs. Patel's voice carried over the fence. "Beautiful blooms this year," her neighbor called from her own yard. At 72, Kamala Patel had the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades watching the neighborhood's dramas unfold from her kitchen window. "Thank you." Margaret straightened, brushing soil from her knees. "Robert always said roses need attention, not interference." Mrs. Patel's smile was knowing. "Wise man, your Robert. He understood the difference between care and control." Before Margaret could respond, Jessica's voice cut through the afternoon air. "Margaret, could you come help with the recycling? I've organized it by material type, but you need to understand the new system." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Being summoned like a child, in front of Mrs. Patel, to learn how to sort her own recycling. "I'll be right there," she called back, her voice strained. Mrs. Patel's expression had shifted, becoming more alert. She watched as Jessica appeared at the back door, hands on her hips in a posture that suggested impatience with Margaret's delay. "The pickup is tomorrow," Jessica called, "and I noticed you put glass in the plastic bin again. We really need consistency if this is going to work." Margaret excused herself from Mrs. Patel with burning cheeks, but not before she caught her neighbor's thoughtful expression, the look of someone filing away important information. That evening, Margaret attempted to reclaim some small territory. When Jessica announced plans for takeout Chinese food, Margaret suggested her homemade chicken and dumplings instead. "I've already placed the order," Jessica said without looking up from her phone. "I could call them back, cancel it. I have everything I need for—" "Margaret." Jessica's tone carried a new edge, sharp enough to make David look up from his laptop. "We've talked about this. Sophie's dietary needs come first, and she specifically asked for lo mein." Margaret glanced at Sophie, who was absorbed in coloring, and seemed unaware she'd made any such request. But challenging Jessica in front of the child felt cruel, so Margaret nodded and retreated to her room while they waited for delivery. When David brought her a container of sweet and sour pork an hour later, his face carried the apologetic expression that had become his default. "Mom, Jessica's just trying to help manage the household," he said, settling on the edge of her bed, like he had as a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. "She's good at organization. It's one of her strengths." Margaret looked at her son, 35 years old, but still choosing the path that required the least courage. "And what about my strengths?" David's pause stretched too long. "You're generous, patient. You've given us a home when we needed one most. But not good at managing my own household? That's not what I meant." But his eyes wouldn't meet hers, and Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that Jessica wasn't the only one who saw her as obsolete. Later that night, Margaret lay in Robert's chair, unable to face the bed that increasingly felt like surrender. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jessica and David's voices in the guest room, low, urgent, the kind of conversation that stopped when others entered the room. But tonight, she could make out words. "She's becoming difficult," Jessica was saying, "questioning every decision, undermining the structure I'm trying to create for Sophie's sake. She's adjusting. This is all new for her, too. David, she challenged me about dinner in front of your daughter. That kind of inconsistency confuses children. Sophie needs to see us as a united team, not competing authorities." Margaret's hands clenched on the chair's arms. Competing authorities. "In her own home, maybe we need firmer boundaries," Jessica continued. "Clear expectations about decision-making authority while we're living here, for everyone's benefit." The word authority hung in the darkness like a threat. Margaret stared at the ceiling, finally understanding what she'd been watching unfold over the past 2 months. This wasn't about efficiency or family harmony or Sophie's well-being. This was about power. And somehow, without realizing it, she'd been surrendering hers one small compromise at a time. Margaret woke in Robert's chair with decision-making authority, echoing in her mind like a mantra she couldn't escape. The morning light felt different somehow, sharper, more revealing, as if the fog that had clouded her vision for 2 months was finally lifting. Downstairs, she found Jessica at the kitchen, table with papers spread before her like a legal briefing. The laminated charts had been joined by what appeared to be official documents, complete with highlighted sections and sticky note tabs. David sat beside his wife, his posture suggesting a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Perfect timing," Jessica said, her smile bright with the kind of confidence that came from holding all the cards. "We need to discuss some household logistics." Margaret poured coffee from the pot that Jessica had relocated again, this time to a cart by the window, apparently to optimize counter space. The ceramic mug she'd retrieved from the high cabinet felt foreign in her hands, like something borrowed from a stranger's kitchen. David and I spent some time last night working through the practical aspects of our living arrangement, Jessica continued, sliding a multi-page document across the table. We think it's important to establish clear expectations for everyone's benefit. Margaret looked down at the papers, her vision blurring slightly as she tried to process what she was seeing. The header read, Residential Lease Agreement, in bold letters, followed by her own name listed as tenant. A lease? The words came out as barely a whisper. More of a rental agreement, Jessica corrected smoothly. Nothing formal, just something. To clarify responsibilities and ensure we're all contributing fairly to household expenses. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the first page. Her monthly rent was listed at well and $200, nearly half her Social Security income. Below that, a section titled House Rules and Regulations filled 2 full pages with restrictions that made her chest tight. No guests without 48-hour advance notice and written approval from primary household managers. No use of common areas. During designated family time, 5 out 8 hour p.m. weekdays, 10 hours a.m. 2 hour p.m. weekends. No noise above conversation level after 9 hours p.m. No personal items in common areas without approval. Television usage limited to assigned time slots. Kitchen access restricted during meal preparation periods, managed by designated household coordinator. This is... Margaret's voice failed her as she continued reading. The document stripped away every freedom she'd taken for granted in her own home, reducing her to the status of a boarder with fewer rights than most tenants. I know it seems like a lot, David said, his voice carrying the apologetic tone she'd grown to despise. But Jessica thinks structure will help everyone know what's expected. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. When had David become someone who could sit calmly while his wife presented his mother with eviction-level restrictions in her own home? The financial contribution is only fair, Jessica added, her tone reasonable and businesslike. You're benefiting from our presence here. Built-in companionship, help with maintenance, someone to watch the house when you're out. It's really quite a bargain when you consider what you'd pay for those services separately. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She was paying for the privilege of being controlled, manipulated, and gradually erased from her own life. The audacity was so complete, so breathtaking, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened, her vision narrowing to tunnel. Focus on Jessica's expectant face. The kitchen walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and insufficient. Margaret gripped the table edge as her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Mom? David's voice sounded far away. Are you okay? But Margaret couldn't answer. The room tilted dangerously, and she had. The sudden, terrifying sensation of falling even though she remained in her chair. This was what drowning felt like, she realized. Not water filling your lungs, but control being stripped away so gradually that you didn't realize you couldn't. Breathe until you were already going under. Should I call someone? David was asking, but Jessica's response was calm, clinical. She's having a stress reaction. Probably overwhelmed by the changes. Maybe some water and quiet time. Overwhelmed by changes. As if Margaret were a confused, elderly woman having trouble adapting to new circumstances, rather than a homeowner being systematically robbed of her autonomy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The doorbell's chime cut through Margaret's panic like a lifeline. Elena's voice followed, calling out as she let herself in with the spare key Margaret had given her years ago. Margaret? I brought those plant cuttings I promised. Elena's words died as she took in the scene. Margaret gasping at her own kitchen table, David hovering helplessly, Jessica calmly organizing papers as if nothing unusual was happening. "What's going on here?" Elena's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through deception to find truth. "Just some family business," Jessica replied smoothly. Margaret's feeling a bit overwhelmed by some household discussions, but Elena's sharp eyes had already found the lease agreement, and her expression shifted from concern to something harder and more dangerous. She moved to Margaret's side, placing a steady hand on her friend's shoulder while her gaze swept over the documents. "A rental agreement," Elena said slowly, her voice deadly quiet. "In Margaret's own home." "It's really not that unusual," Jessica began, but Elena's raised hand cut her off. "David." Elena's tone could have frozen water. "Do you understand what your wife has done here?" David shifted uncomfortably. "We just thought some structure—" "Your wife has just presented your mother with an illegal document attempting to convert her from homeowner to tenant in her own property." Elena's legal training was evident in every precisely chosen word. "This has no legal validity whatsoever, and in some jurisdictions could be considered elder abuse." The words hung in the air like a slap. Jessica's composed mask slipped for the first time, revealing something calculating and desperate underneath. "That's a very serious accusation," Jessica said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "Yes, it is." Elena was already reaching for her phone. "Margaret, I'm calling Carlos Martinez. He specializes in elder law and family disputes." Within an hour, Carlos Martinez sat in Margaret's living room, his presence filling the space with professional authority. A man in his early 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen every variation of family cruelty, he reviewed Jessica's documents with the thoroughness of a surgeon examining a tumor. "Mrs. Chen," he said finally, "this document has no legal standing whatsoever. You cannot be required to pay rent in your own home, nor can anyone restrict your access to your own property. What your daughter-in-law has attempted here could potentially constitute coercion or attempted fraud." Jessica had disappeared upstairs during Carlos's visit, claiming she needed to help Sophie with homework. David remained in the kitchen, his face pale with the dawning realization of what he'd been party to. "What are my options?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier now with professional support beside her. "As the homeowner, you have complete authority over who lives in your house and under what conditions," Carlos explained. "If you wish them to leave, you can require it. If you wish them to stay, any rules or financial arrangements must be ones you agree to, not ones imposed upon you." That evening, after Carlos and Elena had gone and Jessica had retreated to her room claiming a headache, Margaret sat alone in her living room with a box of Robert's belongings she hadn't touched since. His funeral, his letters, their wedding photos, documents from the life they'd built together, evidence of who she'd been before grief made her vulnerable to manipulation. In one of his last letters, written during his final deployment before retirement, Robert had told her about watching younger soldiers lose themselves by trying to keep everyone happy. "Sometimes," he'd written, "the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst instincts. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's enabling." Margaret held the letter to her chest, feeling Robert's presence more strongly than she had in months. He'd known her strength before she'd forgotten it herself. "Grandma?" Sophie's soft voice interrupted her thoughts. The child stood in the doorway in her pajamas, her face troubled. "Are you sad about the papers?" Margaret patted the couch beside her, and Sophie curled up against her grandmother's side with the easy affection that had always existed between them. "Mommy said the papers were to help you," Sophie continued, her 8-year-old logic working through adult complexities. "She said maybe after you got used to having help, you might want to move to one of those nice places where other grandmas live, and then we could stay here and take care of your house for you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Jessica's long-term plan, revealed with a child's innocent honesty. Not just control of Margaret's daily life, but eventually control of her home itself. Did she now? Margaret's voice was calm, but something fundamental shifted inside her chest, a door slamming shut on 2 months of doubt and self-recrimination. After tucking Sophie back into bed, Margaret returned to Robert's chair with his photo in her hands. In the image, he wore his uniform with quiet pride, his eyes holding the strength she'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. "I won't let them erase us," she whispered to his image, feeling something hard and determined crystallize in her chest. "I won't let them win." For the first time in 2 months, Margaret Chen was not asking permission. She was not apologizing for existing. She was not wondering if she was being unreasonable. She was planning war. Margaret woke before dawn with Robert's photo still clutched against her chest, and a clarity that felt like sunlight after months of fog. The house was quiet, holding its breath in the pre-dawn darkness, but she moved through it with the purposeful steps of someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for existing. By 6 a.m., she sat at her kitchen table with Carlos Martinez's business card and a yellow legal pad, making notes in the careful handwriting she'd perfected during 30 years of school administration. By 7, she'd called Carlos and arranged to meet him at his office before the courthouse opened. By 8:30, she held official eviction papers in her hands. 30 days' notice for Jessica and David to vacate the premises. "Are you certain about this?" Carlos asked as they stood in the courthouse parking lot. "Once you serve these papers, there's no going back. Family relationships can be complicated to repair." Margaret thought of Jessica's rental agreement, of being relegated to tenant status in her own home, of Sophie's innocent revelation about plans to move her to a nice place where other grandmas live. "I'm certain," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. The drive home felt like the longest 30 minutes of her life, but also like a journey toward reclaiming herself. Elena was waiting on the front porch with coffee and the kind of fierce smile that had served her well in divorce court. "Ready for this?" Elena asked. "I've been ready for months," Margaret replied. "I just didn't know it yet." Inside, the house hummed with its usual morning routine, Jessica directing traffic from the kitchen, David getting ready for his reduced-hours job, Sophie eating cereal at the table Margaret had bought 30 years ago. The domestic scene would have been peaceful if Margaret hadn't spent the last 2 months learning to see the power dynamics underneath. "Good morning," Jessica said without looking up from her phone, where she was scrolling through what appeared to be apartment listings. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe we could adjust some of the terms in the rental agreement, make it more comfortable for everyone." Margaret set her purse on the counter, her counter in her kitchen, and removed the legal documents. "I have something for you," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jessica's expression shifted as she took in the official letterhead, the formal language, the court seal. The color drained from her face as she read the header. "Notice to quit or pay rent or quit premises." "What is this?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "It's an eviction notice," Margaret said calmly. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was deafening. David looked up from his laptop, Sophie stopped chewing her cereal, and Jessica stared at the papers as if they might burst into flames. "You can't be serious," Jessica said finally, her voice recovering some of its usual authority. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of response to yesterday's rental agreement?" "I'm completely serious." Margaret remained standing, using her height advantage for the first time in months. "This is my house, and I'm exercising my legal right to determine who lives in it." Jessica's composure cracked like ice in spring. "After everything we've done for you? After all the help we've provided? The organization? The improvements to this place?" "Improvements?" Margaret's voice carried a new edge that made David look up sharply. You moved my husband's chair to the basement. You rearranged my kitchen so I need a step stool to reach my own coffee mugs. You changed my Wi-Fi password and created a schedule that made me a guest in my own home. Those were practical changes. Those were power plays. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. And yesterday's rental agreement was the final step in making me a tenant in the house I've owned for 25 years. Jessica's mask slipped completely, revealing something desperate and furious underneath. Fine. You want us gone? We'll go. But don't think for 1 second that I'm letting you anywhere near Sophie after this. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret felt her resolve waver for just a moment, the grandmother's instinct to protect her relationship with Sophie at any cost. You can't make that decision, Margaret said quietly. Sophie isn't your property. Try me. Jessica's voice was ice cold now. You think any court will give visitation rights to an unstable grandmother who throws her own family out on the street? I have documentation of your erratic behavior, your inability to manage household responsibilities, your emotional outbursts. David finally found his voice. Jessica, that's enough. Is it? Jessica whirled on her husband. Your mother just served us with eviction papers, David. She'd rather see her granddaughter homeless than compromise on her precious control issues. We're not homeless, David said weakly. We can find somewhere else. With what money? On your part-time salary? Jessica's voice rose to a pitch that made Sophie push back from the table. She's destroying our family because she can't handle sharing space like a normal person. Margaret felt the familiar urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to find some compromise that would make everyone happy. Then she remembered Robert's letter about boundaries, Carlos's explanation of her legal rights, and 2 months of systematic erasure disguised as helpfulness. I'm not destroying anything, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to manage troubled students and difficult parents. I opened my home to family in need. You turned that generosity into a hostile takeover. Hostile takeover? Jessica laughed, but there was hysteria in the sound. I organized your chaos, managed your household efficiently, tried to create structure that would work for everyone. You imposed rent and restrictions on a homeowner in her own house, Margaret countered. You moved my possessions without permission, changed my passwords, scheduled my television time, and criticized my cooking in front of my granddaughter. You told Sophie my decorating was old lady stuff and planned to eventually move me to a senior facility so you could have my house. The last revelation hit like a bomb. David's face went white, and even Jessica seemed momentarily speechless. Sophie told you that? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Children repeat what they hear, Margaret said quietly. And they understand more than adults think they do. As if summoned by her name, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face streaked with tears. Why is everyone yelling? She asked, her voice small and frightened. The sight of the child's distress broke something in the room's tension, but also hardened Margaret's resolve. This was exactly why boundaries mattered. Children needed adults who could provide stability, not adults who fought for control while claiming it was for the child's benefit. We're having a disagreement, Margaret said gently, kneeling to Sophie's level. Sometimes adults need to make difficult decisions. Are we leaving? Sophie asked, looking between the adults with 8-year-old intuition that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Before Margaret could answer, Jessica swept forward and gathered Sophie into her arms with theatrical protectiveness. Yes, sweetheart. We're leaving. Grandma has decided she doesn't want us here anymore. The manipulation was so blatant, so cruel in its use of a child's emotions, that Margaret felt her last vestige of doubt disappear. This wasn't about family harmony or Sophie's well-being. This was about a woman who would weaponize her own daughter to maintain control. That's not true, Sophie, Margaret said firmly, meeting her granddaughter's confused gaze. I love you very much. But your mother and I have different ideas about how families should treat each other. Jessica's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Different ideas? You mean you can't handle that someone younger and more capable might have better ways of doing things? I mean, I won't be controlled in my own home, Margaret replied, standing to her full height. And I won't pretend that's normal or healthy for anyone involved, especially Sophie. The truth hung between them like a bridge neither could cross. Jessica's face cycled through emotions: shock, rage, desperation, and finally something cold and calculating that Margaret recognized as the real person beneath the helpful daughter-in-law mask. "Get your things, Sophie," Jessica said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We're leaving now." "But my stuff," Sophie began. "We'll get your things later." Jessica cut her off, already moving toward the stairs. "David, get the suitcases. We're not staying in this toxic environment another minute." David stood frozen in the kitchen, looking between his wife and his mother like a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Maybe we should talk about this. Find some middle ground." "There is no middle ground," Margaret said firmly. "Either I have autonomy in my own home, or I don't. Jessica made that choice for me yesterday with her rental agreement. I'm making it for myself today." 20 minutes later, Margaret stood in her living room watching her son load suitcases into their car, while Jessica buckled a sobbing Sophie into her car seat. The scene broke her heart, but it didn't break her resolve. Jessica rolled down the passenger window as David started the engine. "You'll regret this," she called out, her voice carrying promises of legal battles and family destruction. "When you're sitting alone in this house with no one who cares about you, you'll remember what you threw away." Margaret stood on her front porch, watching the car disappear down Maple Street, carrying her granddaughter and her son toward an uncertain future. The silence that followed felt like death and rebirth at the same time. For the first time in 2 months, Margaret Chen was alone in her own house. And for the first time in 2 months, the silence felt like peace instead of exile. The silence in Margaret's house felt like walking into a cathedral after months of construction noise. She stood in her living room, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs that had been drowned out by the constant hum of other people's lives, other people's needs, other people's control. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that Jessica had deemed too bright and kept perpetually shaded. Margaret walked to each one, pulling back curtains and opening blinds, letting light flood spaces that had been dimmed for too long. The house seemed to exhale with relief. In the kitchen, she began the slow process of reclamation. Robert's coffee mug came down from the high cabinet and returned to its place on the counter. The coffee maker moved back to its original spot, where the morning light made the controls easier to read. Her grandmother's mixing bowls emerged from their exile behind the organic cereal boxes and found their home again on the accessible shelf. Each small act felt like archaeology, uncovering layers of herself that had been buried under months of practical improvements and family harmony. The laundry basket returned to the hallway closet. The television remote found its way back to her side of the coffee table. The thermostat dial moved from Jessica's preferred 68 degrees to the 72 that had kept Robert comfortable during his final winter. But the most emotional restoration came in the living room, where the ghost of Robert's chair had haunted the space for weeks. Margaret stood in the empty corner, remembering how the brown leather recliner had anchored not just the room's furniture arrangement, but their entire evening routine. She could almost see Robert there, glasses perched on his nose as he read the newspaper, looking up to share some amusing tidbit or political observation. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted her reverie. Through the window, she watched David climb out of his sedan alone, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man who'd been forced to choose sides and wasn't sure he'd chosen correctly. Margaret opened the door before he could knock, noting how he hesitated on the threshold as if uncertain of his welcome. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone navigating a minefield. "This is your childhood home," Margaret replied, stepping aside. "You're always welcome here." David entered but didn't sit, instead standing in the living room with his hands in his pockets, looking around at the restored space with something that might have been recognition or regret. "Mom, I need you to understand. Jessica's at the Comfort Inn with Sophie. She's scared and angry, and she's talking about lawyers and custody restrictions." His words came out in a rush, as if he'd rehearsed them during the drive over. "Sophie's crying for you, asking why she can't come home." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain steady. "This is about more than one argument, David. This is about patterns that have been building for months." "She was trying to help," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe her methods were intense, but her intentions were good." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd spent his entire adult life avoiding difficult truths. "Do you remember what happened yesterday?" "The rental agreement she presented." "To me?" David's face reddened. "That was?" "She thought structure would help everyone understand expectations. She tried to make me a tenant in my own home, David. She listed herself as the household manager with authority over my access to my own kitchen, my own television, my own common areas." Margaret's voice remained calm, but steel ran beneath. That wasn't helping. That was taking over." "But, Mom, if you just—" David began, then stopped as he realized what he was about to say. "If I just what? Accepted it? Been grateful for the privilege of paying rent to live in my own house according to her rules?" The question hung between them like a chasm neither could cross. David's silence was answer enough. After he left, Margaret found herself drawn upstairs to the guest room Jessica and David had occupied. The space felt different now, lighter somehow, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted. As she gathered the few items they'd left behind, her hand brushed against something wedged between the mattress and bed frame, Jessica's journal. Margaret hesitated, her upbringing warring with curiosity. But this wasn't casual snooping. This was about understanding what she'd been living through, what plans had been made around her without her knowledge. The entries were methodical, clinical in their detachment. Jessica had documented Margaret's resistance to household improvements and inability to adapt to multi-generational living. She'd noted Margaret's attachment to outdated possessions and inefficient routines. But the most chilling entries outlined a long-term plan. Week 6, M becoming more dependent on our organization. Good progress. Need to gradually introduce concept of senior living as positive choice. Week 8, M struggling with new systems. Shows signs of confusion about household management. Building case for cognitive concerns. Week 10, researched senior communities and area. Sunrise Manor has memory care options. Could present as temporary respite initially. Margaret's hands trembled as she read Jessica's careful documentation of her supposed decline, her manufactured helplessness, her constructed unsuitability for independent living. Every kindness, every adaptation she'd made to accommodate Jessica's demands had been twisted into evidence of incompetence. The journal painted a picture of systematic gaslighting so thorough that Margaret felt nauseated reading it. Jessica hadn't just wanted control of the house, she'd been methodically building a case to have Margaret removed from it entirely. When Elena arrived that evening with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine, she found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with the journal open before her. "Jesus Christ," Elena breathed after reading several entries. "Margaret, this is psychological abuse. Documented psychological abuse." "I kept thinking I was being too sensitive," Margaret said quietly. "That maybe she was right about my housekeeping, my routines, my ability to manage things." Elena sat beside her friend, her expression fierce with the protective anger Margaret had always admired. "Listen to me carefully. Nothing in this journal describes reality. Everything here describes a deliberate campaign to undermine your confidence and autonomy. They talked late into the evening, Elena helping Margaret understand the psychology of what she'd experienced, how manipulators isolated their victims from support systems, how they created chaos and then positioned themselves as the solution, how they redefined normal until their victims lost track of what healthy boundaries looked like. The scary thing is how gradual it was, Margaret said, refilling their wine glasses. Each change seemed so reasonable by itself. That's how it works, Elena replied. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one justified. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Patel appeared at Margaret's door with a covered dish and the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this conversation. "I brought DIL," she said simply, "and I thought, perhaps we should talk." Over lunch, Mrs. Patel shared her own story of boundaries and family expectations. How her eldest son had returned from college with grand plans to modernize her household. How his wife had suggested improvements that gradually eroded Mrs. Patel's authority in her own space. "I made the mistake once of trying to be the accommodating mother-in-law," Mrs. Patel said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It nearly cost me my sense of self." "What did you do?" "I remembered that respect must be mutual, or it is not respect at all. I told my son that love does not require surrender of dignity." Mrs. Patel's smile was gentle but firm. "It was difficult. There were tears, accusations, threats to limit my time with grandchildren. But in the end, we found our way to a relationship based on actual respect rather than my fear of losing them." "And your grandchildren?" They learned that grandma has boundaries, and that boundaries make relationships stronger, not weaker. Children understand fairness better than adults sometimes. That afternoon brought a phone call that changed everything. Margaret was in her garden, finally tending to roses that had been neglected during the months of family crisis, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar area code. "Mrs. Chen? This is Diane Chen, David's sister." Margaret's trowel stilled in her hand. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in over 2 years, not since the funeral where Diane had stayed for exactly 24 hours before returning to her medical practice in Seattle. "Diane." Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. I got a call from Jessica." Diane's voice carried the clinical tone Margaret remembered, professional, detached, slightly impatient. "She's concerned about your mental state, says you've become unstable, making erratic decisions that are affecting Sophie's well-being." Margaret felt the familiar knot of self-doubt begin to form, then remembered Jessica's journal, Elena's explanations, Mrs. Patel's wisdom. "And what do you think?" Margaret asked carefully. "I think," Diane said after a pause, "that Jessica called the wrong person if she expected automatic support. I've been watching David enable poor behavior for years, but I also think there's more to this story than I'm getting from anyone involved." Margaret heard something in her daughter's voice that hadn't been there during their last conversation. Curiosity rather than judgment, interest rather than obligation. "Would you like to hear the other side?" Margaret asked. "Actually," Diane said, "I think I'd like to see for myself. I can be there tomorrow if you're willing to have me." After hanging up, Margaret called Carlos Martinez for advice about grandparents' rights and custody concerns. His assessment was both reassuring and sobering. "Jessica can't legally prevent you from seeing Sophie without cause," he explained. "But she can make it difficult, expensive, and emotionally costly. The question is how far you're willing to go to maintain that relationship." Margaret looked around her reclaimed kitchen, at Robert's coffee mug in its proper place, at the afternoon light streaming through windows that were no longer kept shuttered. "As far as necessary," she said, "but not at the cost of everything else I am." That evening, Margaret sat in Robert's chair, retrieved from her bedroom and restored to its place of honor by the living room window. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its familiar evening rhythms, but inside, everything felt different. She was alone for the first time in months, but she wasn't lonely. She was free for the first time in months, but that freedom came with costs she was still calculating. Tomorrow would bring Diane, with all the complications that relationship carried. Next week would bring decisions about Sophie, about family, about how much she was willing to sacrifice to rebuild connections that had been poisoned by manipulation and control. But tonight, Margaret Chen sat in her husband's chair, in her own living room, and for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Margaret woke in Robert's chair to the sound of a rental car pulling into her driveway. Through the morning light, she watched a woman emerge who looked like a polished version of herself from 30 years ago. Tailored blazer, efficient movements, the kind of purposeful stride that announced competence before words were spoken. Diane Chen had inherited Robert's height and Margaret's bone structure, but everything else about her seemed designed to distance herself from her origins. Even her hair, cut in a sleek bob that framed her face with surgical precision, spoke of someone who'd spent years crafting herself into something unrecognizable from the angry 18-year-old who'd left home promising never to return. "Hello, Mother." Diane's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone conducting a medical consultation as Margaret opened the front door. "You look well." "You look successful," Margaret replied, noting how her daughter's gaze swept over the house with the same assessing quality Jessica had displayed, but without the calculating hunger. Diane entered the living room, her attention immediately drawn to Robert's chair in its restored position by the window. "Dad's chair is back where it belongs." "It spent some time in exile," Margaret said carefully. "I imagine it did." Diane's tone suggested she understood more than she was saying. She settled on the couch with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. "So, tell me about Jessica." Margaret found herself recounting the past few months with surprising detachment, as if narrating someone else's story. The gradual changes, the systematic control, the rental agreement that had finally broken through her tolerance. Diane listened without interruption, her expression growing more clinical with each detail. "Classic manipulation tactics," Diane said when Margaret finished. "Isolation, gaslighting, incremental boundary violations disguised as helpfulness. It's textbook psychological abuse." The professional assessment was validating, but Margaret detected something else in her daughter's tone. Disappointment that wasn't entirely about Jessica. "You want to say something else?" Margaret observed. Diane's smile was sharp-edged. "I want to say that none of this surprises me. David's always been weak when it comes to conflict, and you've always enabled that weakness by protecting him from consequences." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Margaret's mind drifted to memories she'd buried under layers of maternal protectiveness. David at 12, letting his friend take the blame for a broken window rather than face Robert's disappointment. David at 16, allowing Margaret to call his teacher about missed assignments instead of taking responsibility himself. David at 25, moving back home after his first job layoff and staying for 8 months while Margaret did his laundry and cooked his meals. "And you?" Margaret asked quietly. "What did I enable in you?" "Nothing." Diane's voice carried the weight of old resentment. "You were too busy protecting David to enable anything in me. I had to learn to fight my own battles because you were always fighting his." The accusation hung between them like a bridge neither had been willing to cross for 27 years. Margaret remembered the fights. Diane at 14, demanding. To quit violin lessons Margaret had insisted would build character. Diane at 16, fighting for permission to take advanced science courses Margaret thought were too challenging for a young lady. Diane at 17, accepted to pre-med programs Margaret worried would take her too far from family. "I was trying to protect you both," Margaret said weakly. "You were trying to keep us safe," Diane corrected. "There's a difference. Protection prepares children for the world. Safety tries to keep the world away from children." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of car doors slamming interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they watched David emerge from his sedan, followed by Jessica carrying Sophie. The child looked exhausted, her face puffy from crying, while Jessica's expression suggested someone preparing for war. "Interesting timing," Diane murmured, her professional demeanor sharpening. Jessica entered the house like she still lived. There, her confidence only wavering slightly when she noticed the stranger on the couch. "Margaret, we need to talk. Sophie hasn't stopped crying since yesterday, and—" She paused, taking in Diane's expensive clothes and clinical gaze. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." "Dr. Diane Chen," Diane replied, not rising from her seat. "David's sister." Margaret watched Jessica's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been hope. The woman who'd spent months manipulating, Margaret clearly saw Diane as a potential ally, another family member who might side against the unreasonable grandmother. "Of course, David's mentioned you." Jessica's smile brightened with practiced warmth. Doctor, how impressive. I'm so glad you're here. Your mother has been." "Well, I'm sure David's told you about the situation." "He's told me his perspective," Diane said carefully. "I'm still gathering information." Jessica settled onto the couch as if claiming territory, Sophie curled against her side. "It's such a difficult situation. I've been trying so hard to create a stable environment for Sophie, but Margaret's been resistant to any kind of structure or cooperation. Yesterday, she just snapped, threw us out with no warning, no discussion." Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but Diane's raised hand stopped her. "I see," Diane said, her tone professionally neutral. "And this stable environment you were creating. Tell me about that." Jessica launched into her familiar narrative about household organization, family harmony, and Margaret's inability to adapt to multi-generational living. She painted herself as the reasonable mediator, trying to help an elderly woman who'd become set in her ways, possibly even experiencing some cognitive decline. Margaret watched her daughter's face during Jessica's performance, noting how Diane's expression remained politely attentive while her eyes grew progressively colder. "That's quite a comprehensive assessment," Diane said when Jessica finished. "Tell me, what's your background in geriatric psychology?" Jessica blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your evaluation of my mother's cognitive state and adaptive capabilities. What's your professional qualification for making that assessment?" The question landed like a scalpel, precise and cutting. Jessica's practiced composure flickered. "I don't need professional qualifications to observe concerning behavior," Jessica replied, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Actually, you do," Diane said calmly. "Making claims about someone's mental competency without proper training or assessment is not only inappropriate, it can be legally problematic." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. This was what she'd needed for months. Someone who saw through Jessica's manipulations and called them what they were. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," David interjected, his voice carrying the placating tone Margaret recognized from childhood. "Everyone's upset. Everyone said things they don't mean." "Have they?" Diane's attention shifted to her brother with surgical focus. "David, in your assessment, was Mother displaying signs of cognitive decline? Or was she resisting having her autonomy systematically stripped away in her own home?" The question forced David to confront what he'd been avoiding for months. Margaret watched her son's face crumble as he realized he couldn't maintain his fiction of neutrality any longer. "She wasn't. I mean, Mom's been fine, sharp as ever." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Then why? Diane continued relentlessly. Did you support your wife's attempts to control her household, her possessions, and her daily routines? The silence that followed was devastating. Sophie looked between the adults with the wide-eyed confusion of a child watching her world fragment, while Jessica's face cycled through anger, desperation, and something that looked like fear. I think we should focus on what's best for Sophie, Jessica said finally, her last card played with trembling hands. She needs stability, not adults fighting over control issues. Agreed, Diane said, surprising everyone. She turned to Sophie, with the gentle tone she probably used with young patients. Sophie, would you like to see the garden? I think your grandmother has some flowers that might interest you. Sophie looked to Jessica for permission, but Diane was already standing, extending her hand to the child with the kind of natural authority that brooked no resistance. Come on, let the adults finish their conversation. After they left, the living room felt charged with unresolved tension. Jessica sat straighter, preparing for what she clearly saw as the next phase of battle. Your daughter seems quite art-direct, Jessica said to Margaret, her tone suggesting this wasn't entirely a compliment. She's honest, Margaret replied. It's a family trait that sometimes skips a generation. Through the window, Margaret could see Diane kneeling in the garden beside Sophie, pointing out different flowers and listening to the child's questions with genuine attention. Sophie was smiling for the first time since the confrontation began, her natural curiosity emerging as she bonded with this new aunt who treated her like an intelligent person rather than a pawn in adult games. She's good with her, David observed, his voice carrying surprise and something that might have been envy. She's a pediatrician, Margaret said. She understands children. But not family dynamics, Jessica added quickly. She's been absent for 20 years? She doesn't understand the complexities of our situation. 27 years, Margaret corrected quietly. And maybe that distance gives her perspective we lack. When Diane returned with Sophie, the child was chattering about butterflies and asking if she could help plant more flowers next time she visited. The word visit hung in the air like a lifeline Margaret hadn't dared hope for. We should go, Jessica said abruptly, standing with the jerky movements of someone whose control was slipping. Sophie needs her nap, and we have appointments this afternoon. But Sophie had found her voice. Can I stay with Grandma and Aunt Diane, please, just for a little while? The question created a moment of perfect stillness, everyone understanding that this simple request represented so much more than a child wanting to spend time with family. Jessica's face went through rapid calculations, weighing the risk of appearing unreasonable against the danger of losing control of the narrative. Maybe another time, sweetheart, when everyone isn't so emotional. As they prepared to leave, Diane spoke quietly to Jessica by the door, her words too low for Margaret to hear but clear enough in their impact. Jessica's face paled, and she nodded once before hurrying Sophie to the car. What did you say to her? Margaret asked after they'd driven away. Diane's smile was sharp as a surgical blade. I explained that I'd be staying in town for a few days, and that I'd be very interested in observing how she manages co-parenting with David. Professional curiosity, you understand. Margaret felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep inside, the first genuine laughter she'd experienced in months. You're terrifying, she said with genuine admiration. I learned from the best, Diane replied, her expression softening slightly. Dad always said the best defense was making sure your opponent understood exactly what they were up against. That evening, as they sat in the kitchen sharing takeout Thai food, Margaret and Diane began the careful process of rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured by misunderstanding and stubborn pride. I was too protective, Margaret admitted. The words difficult, but necessary. I thought I was keeping you safe, but I was really keeping you small. And I was too angry, Diane replied. I spent so many years being furious about what you didn't let me do that I forgot to appreciate what you did give me." They talked until midnight, 27 years of misunderstanding, slowly giving way to something that might eventually become forgiveness. And tomorrow, Diane would help Margaret navigate the complex battle ahead, not just for Sophie, but for the right to define family on terms that honored love without surrendering dignity. Margaret woke to the sound of her phone ringing at 6 a.m., the harsh electronic tone cutting through the peaceful silence she'd grown to treasure. The display showed Diane's number, and something cold settled in Margaret's stomach as she answered. "Jessica called David at 5:30 this morning," Diane said without preamble, her voice sharp with professional urgency. "She's talking about moving to Phoenix. Claims she has a job interview there next week and that Sophie needs a fresh start away from toxic family dynamics." Margaret's blood went cold. Phoenix was 1,500 miles away, far enough to make regular visits impossible, far enough to effectively end her relationship with Sophie. She sat up in Robert's chair, her mind immediately calculating drive times, flight costs, the logistics of maintaining a relationship across such distance. "Can she do that legally?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer from Diane's tone. "That's what we need to find out. I'm calling your lawyer. Can you be ready in an hour?" By 8 a.m., Margaret found herself back in Carlos Martinez's office, this time with Diane beside her providing the kind of moral support she'd forgotten she needed. The morning sun streamed through Carlos's windows, but the atmosphere in the room was heavy with unspoken dread. Carlos's expression was grave as he reviewed the situation, his fingers steepled in the gesture Margaret had learned meant complicated legal waters ahead. "The legal reality is unfortunately straightforward," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by custody battles. "Jessica, as Sophie's mother, has broad authority to relocate unless there's a specific court order preventing it. In Texas, the parent with primary custody, which appears to be Jessica, given their living arrangements, can generally move with the child." "But David is Sophie's father," Margaret protested. "Doesn't he have a say?" "He does, but only if he's willing to fight for it. He'd need to file for a modification of their custody arrangement, assuming they have one, or establish paternity rights if they don't. Even then, the courts generally favor the parent who can demonstrate that the move serves the child's best interests." Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "From what you've told me about Jessica's approach to conflict resolution, I suspect she's counting on David not fighting this. She's created a situation where challenging her requires him to appear as though he's putting his mother's wishes above his daughter's welfare." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same suffocating sensation she'd experienced when Jessica had first presented the rental agreement. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher than her own comfort or dignity. "What about grandparents' rights?" Margaret asked, though she could already see the answer forming in Carlos's careful expression. "Texas does recognize grandparents' rights, but only under very specific circumstances." Carlos pulled out a thick legal manual, flipping to a section he'd clearly referenced many times before. "You'd need to prove that denying access would significantly harm Sophie's well-being, and that your relationship with her serves her best interests in ways that can't be replicated through other relationships." He paused, looking directly at Margaret with the kind of honest assessment she'd come to value in their professional relationship. "But here's the challenge. Custody disputes involving grandparents are expensive, emotionally devastating, and there's no guarantee of success. We're talking about potentially years of legal battles, tens of thousands of dollars in fees, and the very real possibility that the court sides with the parent's right to make decisions about their child's residence." Diane leaned forward, her medical training evident in the way she processed information. "What are the factors that typically influence these decisions?" "Stability of the child's current environment, the strength of existing relationships, evidence of the child's own preferences if they're old enough to express them coherently, and unfortunately, the financial resources of the parties involved. Carlos's tone was clinical, but not unkind. Jessica could drag this out for months, maybe years, while keeping Sophie hundreds of miles away. She could make visitation expensive and logistically complicated. She could even argue that Margaret's erratic behavior, the eviction, demonstrates instability that makes unsupervised visits inadvisable. Margaret felt the walls closing in, the same sensation of helplessness that had plagued her during the months of Jessica's systematic takeover. The irony was devastating. Standing up for herself had given Jessica ammunition to use against her in the fight for Sophie. "She's using Sophie as a weapon," Diane said flatly, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone making a clinical diagnosis. Classic manipulation tactic: create a crisis, then position yourself as the only solution while making any opposition appear harmful to the child. "The question is," Carlos continued, his gaze fixed on Margaret, "how far are you willing to go? Legal battles like this can consume your finances, your emotional energy, and ironically, your relationship with Sophie herself. Children remember being fought over, and it doesn't always create the outcome grandparents hope for." Margaret's hands trembled as she considered the impossible choice. Fight for Sophie and risk poisoning their relationship with years of legal warfare, bitter depositions, and the inevitable testimony where adults would dissect every interaction for signs of harm or benefit. Or surrender and lose her granddaughter to distance and Jessica's continued manipulation. "There's another factor to consider," Carlos added gently. "Even if you win legal visitation rights, you can't win back a relationship that's been damaged by a bitter custody battle. Sophie will grow up knowing that the adults in her life couldn't find a way to resolve their conflicts without involving lawyers and judges." The weight of that truth settled over Margaret like a lead blanket. Everything she'd fought for, the right to be respected in her own home, the preservation of her relationship with Sophie, the establishment of healthy boundaries, could be destroyed by the very act of fighting for it. "I need to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The drive home was silent, both women lost in their own thoughts. Diane's rental car followed Margaret's sedan through the familiar streets of the neighborhood where Margaret had lived for 25 years, past the elementary school where Sophie was supposed to start 3rd grade in the fall, past the park where Margaret had pushed her granddaughter on swings just weeks ago. That afternoon, as Margaret sat in her garden trying to process the morning's revelations, Mrs. Patel appeared at the fence with the impeccable timing that suggested she'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to offer support. "Difficult day?" Mrs. Patel asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd observed the family drama unfold over months. Margaret found herself sharing the morning's developments, the words spilling out with the desperation of someone who'd run out of options. Mrs. Patel listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding, her hands busy with deadheading roses that bordered their shared fence line. "This Jessica," Mrs. Patel said finally, her tone thoughtful, "she believes she holds all the cards." "Doesn't she?" Margaret asked bitterly, her hands clenched in her lap. "Perhaps not as many as she thinks." Mrs. Patel's smile was enigmatic, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd navigated her own share of family crises. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I have watched you raise 2 children, care for your parents in their final years, support your husband through his illness and death. I have seen how Sophie lights up when she visits you, how she runs to your door with pure joy." Margaret felt tears threatening, the careful composure she'd maintained all day finally beginning to crack. "But legally," she began. "Legal battles are not won only in courtrooms," Mrs. Patel interrupted gently, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "They are won by demonstrating character, stability, and genuine concern for the child's welfare. They are won by showing judges and mediators that some relationships cannot be replaced by geography or convenience. She paused in her gardening, turning to face Margaret directly. If needed, I would be honored to serve as a character witness for you. I have been a teacher for 40 years before retirement. I understand child welfare, and I understand the importance of grandparents in a child's development. The offer was both touching and strategic. Mrs. Patel was not just a neighbor, but a retired educator, a respected community member whose observations would carry weight in any legal proceeding. More importantly, she was offering to stand with Margaret, when many others might prefer to avoid the messiness of family drama. There are others who would speak for you as well, Mrs. Patel continued. Elena, certainly. Your pastor from St. Mary's, where you've volunteered for years. The librarian who's watched you bring Sophie to story time every month. Character. Witnesses matter, Margaret. They show that your relationship with Sophie exists within a community that recognizes its value. Margaret felt something loosening in her chest, a tiny spark of hope in what had felt like complete darkness. Thank you, she said, meaning it more deeply than she could express. That evening brought an unexpected confrontation that would change everything. David arrived alone just after sunset, his face carrying the haggard expression of a man who'd spent the day being pulled in multiple directions. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and he moved with the exhausted gait of someone who'd been walking for hours. Mom, we need to talk, he said, settling heavily into Robert's chair. Without invitation. The casual assumption of comfort in the space struck Margaret as significant. David still saw this as home, still felt entitled to the furniture and familiarity that Jessica had tried to strip away. Jessica's serious about Phoenix, he continued, his voice hollow with exhaustion. She's already looking at apartments online, researching schools for Sophie. She found a job posting at a marketing firm there and submitted her resume this afternoon. And you're supporting this? Margaret asked, though she could already see the answer in his tortured expression. I don't know what to support anymore, David admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of impossible choices. Jessica says you're trying to break up our family, that your behavior has become erratic and potentially harmful to Sophie. She says the eviction was proof that you can't handle conflict maturely, that you put your own pride above family harmony. Margaret felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt beginning, the insidious voice that had whispered for months that maybe Jessica was right, maybe she had overreacted, maybe her actions really were harmful to everyone she claimed to love. Then she remembered Jessica's journal, the systematic documentation of her supposed incompetence, the calculated plan to eventually move her to assisted living while taking over her house. The memory crystallized her resolve, burning away the self-doubt with the clarity of righteous anger. David, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion roiling beneath, do you believe I'm a danger to Sophie? The question hung in the air between them, forcing David to confront what he'd been avoiding for months. Margaret watched, her son's face as he struggled with the answer, seeing the moment when his carefully constructed neutrality finally crumbled under the weight of honest assessment. His shoulders sagged as if a tremendous burden had been lifted, or perhaps as if he'd finally acknowledged one he'd been carrying all along. No, he whispered, the word barely audible. You're not dangerous to anyone. You're not erratic or unstable or any of the things Jessica claims. You're just trying to protect your own dignity. The admission broke something open in both of them. David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of choices he'd avoided making for too long. Then, why are you letting Jessica threaten to take Sophie away from me? Margaret asked, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. Because I don't know how to stop her, David said, his words muffled by his hands. Because every time I try to stand up to her, she makes me feel like I'm being unreasonable, like I'm choosing sides instead of thinking about what's best for Sophie. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than they'd been in months. She's so good at making her arguments sound logical, at making me feel guilty for questioning her decisions. She says I'm weak, that I can't see the big picture, that I'm letting childhood attachments cloud my judgment about what's really best for our daughter. Margaret recognized the language of manipulation, the way Jessica twisted legitimate concerns into personal failings, made reasonable resistance appear selfish or misguided. "And what do you think is best for Sophie?" Margaret asked gently. David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the neighborhood where he'd grown up, where Sophie had been learning to ride her bike, where 3 generations of family, history had played out in the mundane moments that create lasting bonds. "She should know her grandmother," he said finally, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She should grow up understanding that families can have disagreements without destroying each other. She should see adults who can set boundaries without cruelty, who can apologize when they're wrong, who can love each other even when they don't always like each other." The words carried the weight of a man finally articulating what he'd known all along but been too afraid to voice. "She should see that love doesn't require surrender," David continued, his voice gaining conviction, that caring about someone doesn't mean accepting their control, that healthy relationships require mutual respect, not just family obligation. Margaret felt tears threatening as she recognized Robert's wisdom in their son's words, the values they'd tried to instill during his childhood finally emerging in his adult crisis. "Then tell Jessica that," Margaret said simply. The confrontation came that night, and Margaret heard every word through the thin walls of the Comfort Inn where Jessica had been staying since the eviction. David's voice carried a new authority she hadn't heard since he was a teenager, defending his right to choose his own college major over his parents' preference for something more practical. Margaret hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but she'd driven to the motel parking lot to give David moral support, and the late evening quiet carried voices through the windows with devastating clarity. "We're not moving to Phoenix," David said, his words clear and final. "Sophie stays here, near her grandmother, near her school, near the friends she's making and the life she's building." Jessica's response was immediate and devastating, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested she hadn't expected this level of resistance. "If you don't support this move, you're choosing your mother over your wife. You're choosing the past over our future, choosing obligation over opportunity." "I'm choosing Sophie over manipulation," David replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm choosing what's best for our daughter over what's convenient for your control issues." Margaret could hear movement in the room, pacing perhaps, or the sound of someone gathering belongings with sharp, angry movements. "Control issues." Jessica's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. "I'm trying to create a stable future for our family while you cling to your mother's apron strings. I'm trying to move us forward while you drag us backward into dysfunction. The only dysfunction I see is a woman who tried to charge my mother rent in her own house, who documented her supposed incompetence in a journal, who planned to have her moved to assisted living so we could take over her property." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret realized that David had found Jessica's journal, had read the calculated plans that had horrified Margaret just days earlier. "You read my private thoughts," Jessica said finally, her voice cold and dangerous. "I read your plan to systematically destroy my mother's independence and steal her home," David shot back. "There's nothing private about fraud, Jessica." "Fine." Jessica's voice carried the icy finality of someone playing their last card. "Then you can explain to Sophie why Mommy had to leave. You can explain why Daddy cared more about Grandma's feelings than about keeping his family together." "You're the one choosing to leave," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "You're the one using our daughter as a weapon to force compliance with your demands." "I'm protecting our daughter from a toxic environment," Jessica replied. But even she seemed to recognize how hollow the words sounded. The door slammed with finality, leaving David alone with choices he'd avoided making for too long. Margaret sat in her car in the motel parking lot, Engine off, hands trembling on the steering wheel. Through the illuminated window, she could see David's silhouette as he sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, finally confronting the reality of his marriage. 20 minutes later, he emerged from the room carrying a small suitcase and Sophie's favorite stuffed elephant. Margaret rolled down her window as he approached her car. "She's gone," he said simply. Took Sophie to her room, packed her things, and left. She said she's driving to Phoenix tonight, that she'll call when she's ready to discuss visitation terms with adults who understand priorities. Margaret's, heart clenched. "David, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," he interrupted, his voice carrying surprising strength. "This was my choice. Finally." But as they drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's departure was strategic rather than final. This felt like a tactical retreat, not surrender. Her instincts proved correct. The next morning brought a text from Jessica that was equal parts threat and manipulation. "Sophie is asking for you, but I've explained that Grandma cares more about being right than about family harmony. When you're ready to apologize and make real changes, we can discuss supervised visits. Until then, Sophie needs to understand that actions have consequences." Margaret showed the message to Diane, who was researching family law on her laptop. At the kitchen table, while David made phone calls to lawyers and his employer about emergency family leave. "She's not giving up," Diane observed, her clinical assessment cutting through emotion to tactical reality. "This is psychological warfare. She's using Sophie's confusion and distress to pressure you into capitulating to her original demands." "I know," Margaret said, surprising herself with her calmness. "But I also know that giving in to emotional blackmail won't actually help Sophie in the long run." Through the window, Margaret could see Mrs. Patel tending her garden, a steady presence in a world that had been turned upside down. Elena was coming for dinner, bringing the strength of friendship that had sustained Margaret through the darkest months. Diane would stay another week, helping to establish new routines and legal protections. Most importantly, David was finally fighting for what he believed was right, even when that fight came at enormous personal cost. The battle wasn't over. Jessica would regroup, find new tactics, perhaps even succeed in her plans to relocate. But Margaret had learned something crucial in the past 24 hours. Sometimes protecting the people you love means refusing to surrender your own dignity, even when surrender seems like the easier path. Sometimes love requires courage, and courage requires boundaries. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give a child is the example of an adult who understands the difference between peace and capitulation, between family harmony and family subjugation. As Margaret prepared for what promised to be a long and difficult battle ahead, she felt Robert's presence more strongly than she had since his death. In her mind, she could hear his voice from that final letter. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. She wouldn't enable Jessica's manipulation anymore, no matter the cost. Sophie deserved adults who modeled healthy relationships, not adults who sacrificed principle for the illusion of peace. The fight for Sophie had begun in earnest. 3 days after Jessica's midnight departure to Phoenix, Margaret's phone rang. At 7 a.m. with David's number flashing on the screen. His voice carried an urgency that made her instantly alert. "She's back," he said without preamble. "Jessica's back and she's not alone. She's got Sophie and she's coming to the house." "Mom, she's got a lawyer with her." Margaret's blood ran cold. Through her kitchen window, she could see a black SUV pulling into her driveway, followed by a sleek sedan that screamed expensive legal representation. Jessica emerged first, her movements sharp and purposeful, dressed in a navy suit that suggested she'd prepared for this confrontation with military precision. Sophie followed reluctantly, her small frame dwarfed by the adult drama swirling around her. "Diane," Margaret called upstairs, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We need you down here. Now." By the time the doorbell rang, Margaret had positioned herself in her own living room like a general preparing for battle. Diane stood beside her, professional and imposing in her own way, while David paced near the window with the nervous energy of a man who'd finally chosen sides, but wasn't sure he was ready for the consequences. Elena arrived through the back door with impeccable timing, her former attorney instincts clearly activated by the crisis unfolding. Mrs. Patel followed moments later, carrying a plate of cookies and the kind of calm determination that comes from decades of watching neighborhood dramas play out. "Quite the gathering," Diane murmured as the doorbell chimed again, more insistently this time. Margaret opened the door to find Jessica flanked by a man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of confident aggression that made Margaret's skin crawl. Sophie hung back behind them, her face pale and confused, clutching her stuffed elephant like a lifeline. "Mrs. Chen," the lawyer said before Jessica could speak, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to intimidating elderly clients. "I'm Richard Blackwood, representing Ms. Torres Chen in this matter. We need to discuss the welfare of the minor child, Sophie Chen." "This is my home," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If you want to discuss anything, you can do it civilly or not at all." Jessica stepped forward, her expression a careful mask of concerned reasonableness. "Margaret, I know you're upset about our disagreement, but we need to think about Sophie's best interests. I've brought Mr. Blackwood because I'm concerned about your mental state and its impact on my daughter's well-being." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same suffocating sensation that had plagued her for months whenever Jessica launched into her reasonable-sounding manipulations. But this time, Margaret wasn't alone. Diane stepped forward with the kind of clinical precision that had made her successful in her medical career. "I'm Dr. Diane Chen," she said, her voice carrying professional authority that immediately shifted the room's dynamic. "Margaret's daughter and a practicing physician. Before we discuss anyone's mental state, perhaps we should establish some ground rules about who's qualified to make such assessments." Blackwood's confidence flickered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Dr. Chen, while your concern for your mother is understandable, we have documentation of concerning behavior patterns that suggest—" "What documentation?" Elena interrupted, stepping forward with the kind of sharp smile that had served her well in divorce court. "Elena Vasquez, former family law attorney. I'm very interested in seeing this alleged documentation." Jessica's composure cracked slightly, as she realized she was facing not just Margaret's emotions, but a room full of professionals who weren't intimidated by legal posturing. "I've been keeping detailed records," Jessica said, producing a folder thick with papers. "Instances of erratic behavior, emotional instability, inappropriate responses to reasonable household management." Margaret felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt beginning, but Diane's hand on her shoulder anchored her to the present moment. "May I see these records?" Diane asked, her tone carrying the kind of medical authority that brooked no argument. As Jessica handed over the folder, Margaret noticed Sophie edging closer to Mrs. Patel, who was quietly offering cookies and gentle reassurance. The child's instinctive movement toward comfort rather than her own mother spoke volumes about the psychological dynamics at play. Diane reviewed Jessica's documentation with clinical thoroughness, her expression growing progressively colder with each page. The papers detailed Margaret's resistance to organizational improvements, her inappropriate emotional reactions to constructive feedback, and her inability to adapt to changing household needs. "This is fascinating," Diane said finally, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that Margaret remembered from childhood arguments. "These records seem to document my mother's refusal to surrender autonomy in her own home rather than any kind of mental decline." She turned to address Blackwood directly. "As a physician, I can tell you that nothing in these documents suggests cognitive impairment or mental instability. What they do suggest is a systematic campaign to undermine an elderly woman's confidence and independence. Dr. Chen, Blackwood began, his tone condescending, with respect, you're not a psychiatrist, and your family relationship creates obvious bias. You're absolutely right, Diane interrupted smoothly, which is why I arranged for my mother to undergo a comprehensive geriatric assessment yesterday at Methodist Hospital. The results show normal cognitive function, no signs of depression, or anxiety beyond what would be expected from months of psychological manipulation and excellent decision-making capacity. Margaret stared at her daughter in amazement. She had no memory of any hospital visit, but Diane's confidence suggested she was prepared for this exact challenge. Jessica's face went white. That's impossible. I would have known. Would you? Diane's smile was sharp as a scalpel. You've been in Phoenix for 3 days. Plenty of time for Mother to address concerns about her competency, assuming she had any such concerns. The lie was bold and perfectly calculated, Margaret realized. Diane was betting that Jessica wouldn't call her bluff in front of a lawyer and witnesses, and that Blackwood wouldn't demand immediate verification of medical records he had no legal right to access. Furthermore, Elena added, stepping forward with her own folder, we have our own documentation to share. Mrs. Chen discovered this journal in the guest room after Ms. Torres Chen's departure. Margaret watched Jessica's face crumble as Elena produced the journal that had revealed Jessica's systematic plans to undermine Margaret's independence. Blackwood's expression shifted from confident aggression to professional concern as he realized his client hadn't told him the full story. This journal details a months-long campaign to document fabricated evidence of Mrs. Chen's incompetence, Elena continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting evidence in court. It includes specific plans to manipulate Mrs. Chen into assisted living so that Ms. Torres Chen could assume control of this property. That's private, Jessica said desperately, her composed mask finally slipping completely. You had no right to read my personal thoughts. You had no right to attempt fraud, Margaret replied, her voice steady with newfound strength. You had no right to try to steal my home by manufacturing evidence of my incompetence. For the first time since entering the house, Sophie spoke up, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult posturing with devastating clarity. Mommy, why did you write mean things about Grandma? She asked, her face streaked with tears. Grandma's not crazy. She's just sad sometimes because Grandpa died. The innocence of the observation broke something in the room's tension. Jessica dropped to her knees beside Sophie, her voice taking on the kind of desperate reasonableness that Margaret recognized as her final manipulation tactic. Sweetheart, grown-ups sometimes have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they love. Grandma's been very upset lately, and Mommy was worried about you being around someone who might not be able to take care of you properly. But Grandma takes good care of me, Sophie replied with the logic of childhood. She makes me pancakes and reads me stories and lets me help in the garden. You're the one who makes everyone cry. The words hit like physical blows. Jessica's face cycled through shock, anger, and something that looked like genuine pain. For the first time, Margaret saw past the manipulation to the damaged person underneath. A woman whose childhood and foster care had taught her that control was the only path to security, that vulnerability led to abandonment. Jessica, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying compassion despite everything that had happened between them. I understand that you're scared. I understand that losing your job and depending on others feels like losing control of your life. Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down her face as months of carefully maintained control gave way to raw desperation. You don't understand anything, she said, her voice breaking. You've never had to depend on anyone's charity, never had to smile and be grateful while someone else makes decisions about your life. You've never been 8 years old and moved from house to house, never knowing if the next family will keep you or decide you're too much trouble. The revelation hung in the air, providing context for Jessica's behavior without excusing it. Margaret felt her anger softening into something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding of the trauma that had shaped Jessica's desperate need for control. "You're right," Margaret said gently. "I've been lucky in ways you weren't. But that doesn't give you the right to inflict that same powerlessness on others. That doesn't make it acceptable to try to control my life the way yours was controlled." David, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Jessica, I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing sides, about putting family first. You're right that I've been avoiding difficult choices, but the choice I'm making now isn't between you and my mother. It's between healthy relationships and controlling ones." He moved to stand beside Margaret, his gesture carrying the weight of a decision that had cost him months of agonizing internal conflict. "I love you," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I can't support behavior that hurts the people I care about. I can't teach Sophie that love means accepting control, that family means surrendering autonomy." Jessica's face contorted with rage and betrayal. "So you're choosing her? After everything we've built together, after all the plans we made, you're choosing your mother over your wife?" "I'm choosing what's right over what's easy," David replied, his voice carrying a strength Margaret hadn't heard since he was a child standing up to playground bullies. "I'm choosing to break the cycle of dysfunction instead of perpetuating it." Blackwood cleared his throat, clearly recognizing that his client's case had collapsed around him. "Perhaps we should consider mediation." "No," Margaret said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her power. "There will be no mediation, no compromise, no negotiated settlement. This is my home, and I decide who lives in it and under what conditions." She turned to address Jessica directly, her voice carrying compassion but also unshakable resolve. "You're welcome to visit Sophie here, under supervised conditions, when you're ready to treat this house and its occupants with respect. You're welcome to maintain a relationship with your daughter that doesn't involve manipulating her emotions, or using her as a weapon against adults she loves." "And if I'm not ready to accept those conditions?" Jessica asked, her voice cold with the finality of someone who had lost everything and was prepared to burn what remained. "Then you'll need to decide what matters more," Margaret replied. "Your need for control, or your relationship with your daughter." Mrs. Patel stepped forward then, her elderly presence somehow commanding attention from everyone in the room. "If I may," she said, her voice gentle but carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating family crises. "I have watched this family for many years," she continued, addressing Jessica directly. "I have seen Margaret raise two children with love and patience, support her husband through illness, care for aging parents, volunteer at the school and church. I have seen her welcome you into her home when you needed help, and I have seen how you repaid that kindness." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it was implacable. "I have also seen Sophie's face when she talks about her grandmother, seen how she runs to this house with joy, seen how she wilts when adults fight over her like a possession." Mrs. Patel's gaze moved to Sophie, who was listening with the intense focus of a child trying to understand the adult world that had suddenly become so complicated. "Children know the difference between love and control," Mrs. Patel said simply. "They know the difference between adults who care for them and adults who use them. Sophie knows." The truth of that statement hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Sophie's preference for her grandmother's house, her gravitation toward the adults who offered comfort rather than manipulation, her 8-year-old assessment that Jessica made everyone cry. All of it spoke to a wisdom that transcended adult rationalizations. Blackwood gathered his papers with the efficient movements of someone recognizing a lost cause. "Ms. Torres Chen, I think we need to discuss alternative approaches to this situation." But Jessica was already moving toward the door, her movements sharp and brittle with the kind of rage that comes from having all your manipulations exposed and rejected. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying promises of future battles. "Sophie will understand eventually who really had her best interests at heart." "I hope she does," Margaret replied quietly. "I hope she understands that people who truly love her don't use her as a weapon, don't threaten to take her away from everyone she cares about, don't document her grandmother's supposed failures while planning to steal her home." Jessica's face twisted with something ugly and desperate. "You think you've won, but you've just guaranteed that Sophie grows up without a mother. I won't be manipulated into accepting scraps of visitation while you play the martyred grandmother." "You're manipulating yourself," Diane said coldly. "You're choosing to walk away rather than accept responsibility for your behavior. That's not martyrdom on Mother's part, that's abandonment on yours." The accusation hit home. Jessica's composure cracked one final time, revealing the frightened child underneath the controlling adult. "I never had a choice," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never had anyone who fought for me the way you all fight for each other. I never had a home that felt safe enough to let my guard down." Margaret felt her heart break for the scared little girl Jessica had been, even as she maintained her boundaries against the controlling woman she'd become. "You have choices now," Margaret said gently. "You can choose to get help for the trauma that's driving this behavior. You can choose to build relationships based on mutual respect instead of control. You can choose to be the mother Sophie needs instead of the mother your fear tells you to be." But Jessica was already walking toward the door, Sophie's hand reluctantly in hers, her face set with the kind of bitter determination that suggested she'd rather lose everything than admit she'd been wrong. "Come on, Sophie," she said, her voice artificially bright. "We have a plane to catch." Sophie looked back over, her shoulder at Margaret, her face streaked with tears but her eyes holding a maturity that broke Margaret's heart. "I love you, Grandma," she called out, her voice carrying across the space between them like a bridge that manipulation couldn't burn. "I love you too, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Always." As the door closed behind them, the house fell into silence that felt both empty and full. Empty of the chaos that had defined the last few months, but full of the possibility of rebuilding on foundations of honesty rather than fear. Margaret sank into Robert's chair, exhausted but strangely peaceful. The battle was over, at least for now. Jessica would regroup, perhaps find new ways to wage war from a distance. But the immediate threat to Margaret's autonomy, her home, her sense of self, that had been decisively defeated. "You did the right thing," Elena said softly, settling on the couch beside Diane. "It doesn't feel like victory," Margaret replied, her voice heavy with the cost of standing up for herself. "Real victory rarely does," Mrs. Patel observed, beginning to gather the untouched cookies. "Real victory feels like loss until time proves it was preservation." David remained by the window, watching the cars disappear down Maple Street, his face carrying the weight of choices that had cost him his marriage, but potentially saved his soul. "I should have done this months ago," he said quietly. "You did it when you were ready," Margaret replied. "That's what matters." As the afternoon sun streamed through windows that were no longer kept shuttered, Margaret Chen sat in her husband's chair in her own living room, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her not because she was perfect, but because she was finally, authentically herself. The confrontation was over. The healing could begin. 6 months after the final confrontation, Margaret Chen woke in her own bed rather than in Robert's chair, where grief and vigilance had kept her for so long. The October morning light streamed through windows she kept open now, no longer worried about who might disapprove of her choices. The house felt different, not just because it was hers again, but because it reflected someone who knew her own worth. Robert's chair remained by the living room window, but it was no longer a shrine to the past. It was simply a comfortable, piece of furniture where Margaret sometimes sat to read or watch the neighborhood children walk to school. The doorbell chimed at 10 a.m., and Margaret smiled as she opened it to find Sophie standing on the porch with a small overnight bag and barely contained excitement. David stood behind her, his face carrying the peaceful exhaustion that comes from finally living authentically. "Grandma!" Sophie launched herself into Margaret's arms with exuberant affection, but there was something different now, a security that came from knowing this love didn't depend on adult politics. "Are you ready for our cooking lesson?" Margaret asked, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo. Sophie had requested to learn Margaret's beef stew recipe, the same dish Jessica had once criticized as too heavy and old-fashioned. Now it represented something precious, a connection to family history that no one could organize away. David settled at the kitchen table with coffee and the Saturday paper, a ritual from his weekly visits. He had his own apartment now, small, but comfortable, reflecting his journey toward independence. But Saturday mornings belonged to family in the way that felt healthy rather than obligatory. "How's the job search?" Margaret asked as she helped Sophie tie an apron. "2 more interviews this week," David replied with genuine optimism. "One with a company that actually values work-life balance." David's transformation had been gradual, but profound. Months of therapy had helped him understand the difference between peacekeeping and enabling, between family loyalty and self-sacrifice. He'd learned to set boundaries without guilt, to navigate conflict without immediately capitulating. "Tell Grandma about your new friend," David encouraged. "Her name is Emma, and she just moved here from Dallas," Sophie said, carefully measuring flour. "Her parents got divorced too, so she understands about having 2 houses and different rules, in different places." Margaret felt a pang at Sophie's casual reference to divorce, but also noted the child's resilience. Sophie had adapted to splitting time between David's apartment and Jessica's new place across town with remarkable flexibility. "Emma's grandma lives far away, so I told her she could share you sometimes. Is that okay?" Margaret's throat tightened, with emotion. This was what healthy family relationships looked like: generous, secure, expanding rather than contracting under pressure. "I'd be honored to be a shared grandma," Margaret said. The afternoon brought Elena for their weekly coffee, a tradition that had evolved from crisis management to genuine friendship maintenance. Elena had been Margaret's anchor during the darkest months. "You look different," Elena observed with sharp eyes. "More solid, like you take up the right amount of space in your own life." Margaret considered this as she poured coffee into mugs that lived on accessible shelves, not banished to high cabinets by someone else's organizational preferences. "I've finally learned the difference between accommodating and disappearing," Margaret said. "Between being generous and being invisible." Mrs. Patel arrived through the back door with fresh dal and neighborhood updates. "Speaking of hidden assets," Elena said meaningfully, "any word from Jessica lately?" Jessica's attempts at reconciliation had been sporadic and conditional, messages suggesting supervised visits, when Margaret was ready to acknowledge her role in the family disruption. "She sent Sophie a birthday card," Margaret replied carefully, with a note suggesting Sophie visit Phoenix for Christmas. "And Sophie's response?" Mrs. Patel asked. "She asked if Jessica could come here instead, maybe stay in a hotel and visit like Aunt Diane does. She doesn't want to leave her friends or miss the school Christmas play." Sophie's emotional intelligence continued to astound everyone. Without coaching, she'd gravitated toward relationships that felt safe while maintaining loving but boundaried connections with those who brought chaos. "Margaret," Elena said thoughtfully, "what you've done here, standing up for yourself while keeping your heart open, have you considered sharing this experience with others?" The suggestion had been percolating in Margaret's mind for weeks. Through researching grandparents' rights, she'd discovered forums filled with grandparents dealing with similar manipulation. Their stories felt heartbreakingly familiar. I've been thinking about starting a support group, Margaret admitted. Maybe at the community center, a place for grandparents to share experiences and realize they're not alone. Mrs. Patel's eyes lit up. I know 3 women from my temple who could benefit. One has been paying her son's mortgage for 2 years, while he criticizes her housekeeping and threatens to move his children away if she doesn't comply. The afternoon evolved into impromptu planning, the 3 women drawing on combined experience to outline what such a group might offer. Elena's legal background provided practical guidance, Mrs. Patel's community connections offered access to participants, and Margaret's recent experience provided the emotional framework. We could call it Boundaries and Bridges, Margaret suggested. About maintaining healthy boundaries while building bridges to relationships we want to preserve. That evening, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. How did the cooking lesson go? Did Sophie master the family recipe? Margaret typed back, she's a natural, already talking about teaching it to her friend Emma. The tradition continues. Diane's response came quickly. Dad would be proud of both of you. The simple acknowledgement brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Robert's presence felt stronger now than during those desperate months when she'd clung to his chair like a life preserver. Now he existed in the values she'd rediscovered, in the strength she'd reclaimed. Sunday brought an unexpected call from a Phoenix number. The voice was hesitant, professional. Mrs. Chen? This is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Phoenix Family Services. I'm calling because I have a client who's mentioned your family situation. She's given me permission to reach out about family therapy options. Margaret's heart rate quickened, realizing the caller meant Jessica. She's been in individual therapy for several months, Dr. Martinez continued, working on trauma-related control issues. She'd like to explore family therapy to rebuild relationships with her daughter, and potentially, with your son. The offer hung in the air like a bridge. Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Suspicion warred with cautious hope. What would that involve? Margaret asked carefully. Initially, separate sessions to establish goals and boundaries. No pressure for face-to-face meetings until everyone feels safe. The focus would be on communication skills, boundary respect, and healthy frameworks for co-parenting. Margaret thought of Sophie's resilience, her generous offer to share her grandmother, her matter-of-fact acceptance of family complexity. I'd need to discuss this with David and consider Sophie's needs, Margaret said. Of course, I'll send information about our approach. Take all the time you need. After hanging up, Margaret sat in Robert's chair, processing this unexpected development. Growth and healing were possible. She'd learned that in her own journey. But they required genuine commitment to change, not strategic positioning for renewed control. The decision would ultimately be David's, with input from Sophie when appropriate. Margaret's role was to support whatever choices they made while maintaining her hard-won boundaries. That evening, as Margaret prepared for the week ahead, her support group meeting was Tuesday, Sophie's Halloween costume needed finishing touches, she felt deep satisfaction of a life lived on her own terms. The house reflected 6 months of careful restoration, not just of furniture and routines, but of the woman who occupied the space. Family photos had returned to places of honor, but they shared space with new pictures. Sophie helping in the garden, David teaching her to change a tire, Diane's graduation photo finally displayed with pride rather than hurt. The phone rang. As she was turning off lights, Elena calling about a potential support group participant whose daughter-in-law had gradually taken over her household finances, while claiming to help with money management. Same pattern, Elena said. Gradual erosion of autonomy disguised as assistance. She needs to hear your story, Margaret. She needs to know it's possible to reclaim your life without destroying your family. After hanging up, Margaret walked through her house one more time, a ritual that had evolved from checking locks to appreciating her space. In the kitchen, tomorrow's breakfast ingredients waited on counters she'd organized according to her own logic. In the living room, books sat where she'd left them, not relocated according to someone else's preferences. In her bedroom, Robert's photo smiled from the nightstand, sharing space with a new image. Sophie presenting Margaret with a handmade card reading "Best Grandma Ever" in crayon letters that no organizational system could improve upon. Margaret Chen had spent 40 years building a life with her husband, 2 years mourning his loss, and 6 months fighting to reclaim herself from those who would have erased her in the name of help and family harmony. Now, at 67, she was building something new, a life that honored the past while embracing the future, that maintained boundaries while keeping her heart open, that served others while refusing to disappear in service. The support group would launch next month. Sophie would continue thriving in an environment of clear expectations and unconditional love. David would keep learning to navigate relationships with courage rather than appeasement. Even Jessica might find her way back to the family if she could learn to join rather than control. As she settled into bed, Margaret whispered the prayer she'd developed over these months of transformation. Thank you for the courage to be myself, for the wisdom to love without losing myself, and for the strength to build bridges without burning my foundation. Outside, the neighborhood settled into familiar rhythms. Inside, Margaret Chen slept peacefully in her own home, surrounded by love that honored rather than consumed, supported rather than controlled, celebrated rather than managed. She had learned that the best foundation for any relationship was a person who knew their own worth and refused to sacrifice it for the illusion of peace. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening, because Margaret finally understood that she had everything she needed: her authentic self, a community that valued her contributions, and the hard-won knowledge that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was, at last, enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.